Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Now we move to the discussion part, and I wanted to make it clear that questions are welcome from the audience, but also from the speakers to each other, since there's so many of you up here. And I'm going to take the prerogative as a moderator to ask the first question, which is sort of a general one, and it stems from some of the things that the AAMC is doing, because the timing is sort of good right now. The NIH regulation has been implemented for a year. The Sunshine Act will be implemented in the next year. So if you're thinking of any area of best practices and you want to evaluate the effects of these new regulations, now's the time to think about how you're going to do it. And so AAMC has taken the lead in that, but for example, Todd, your survey is, would they be looking at things like that?
No, we're not currently, and our data, I would argue, doesn't do a good job of capturing the kinds of interactions we're talking about here. We do look at research support, and we do look at licensing-related activities, but that's very different than capturing how many other ways, all the other ways that our faculty engage industry. But it's an interesting question that I will take back to our board, and that is, can we implement a new question or two in the licensing survey, which might get better at these issues.
Anyone else? Go for it. Any questions?
This is Gabriela Versari from Pharma. I have a question for Michelle. In the first program, it kind of reminds me what EMA does around conflict of interest in their panel of experts. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, and if you're familiar with the EMA program.
No, we actually started by just working around what were our needs in FDA and what were our current sources of expertise and where were the gaps. And we found that the gaps were in quick turnaround access to experts that particularly might have conflicts. So we started with the premise that conflicts were okay, and actually in none of these situations are experts eliminated for conflicts. They just have to be balanced. And so we provide the conflict of interest reporting forms to the reviewers that convene the calls with the experts. So it's to say, if you're asking about a Medtronic product to someone who holds Medtronic stock or actually worked on that product, that's fine. But you may also want to balance that with an expert from an opposing viewpoint or opposing interests. So that was the approach that we started with.
And I also, Rasika Kalamegam from the AACR, also a question for McMurry-Heath. So two-part question. One is, you had a second program you were going to talk about, but you didn't have time to get to, so I hope you'll talk about that. And then my other question is, this program that you described, is that something that's specific to the Center for Devices, or is that going to be rolled out across the agency?
It's interesting. We started it as a pilot in the Center for Devices, and the other two medical product centers are actually taking a look at it now for perhaps broader implementation. We now have 25 scientific and professional societies enrolled within the network, and open invitations out to an additional 75. So just in the last 12 months, we've enrolled 25 organizations, and we hope to enroll a lot more. We're trying to cover the landscape so that we have access to any type of expertise that's needed. And we want to make sure we keep utilization of the network up high by perhaps including the other medical product centers as well. So it's a growing entity. Actually, this fall, our Office of Special Health Programs has just been renamed, and Jill will know the name better than I just know the acronym. They'll be having their Health Professions Day on September 18th, and we're actually opening it up to all the organizations within the network to come on campus, talk to the related divisions and branches within FDA, so we can start building those relationships and conversations and create those bridges to experts that we've been trying to do. The other program is our Medical Device Innovation Consortium, which we launched in December, which is actually a freestanding 501c3. It's not a government agency, but we built it in partnership with another 501c3, Life Science Alley. And it is really designed to be what our center director calls Switzerland, a neutral ground for collaborations between academia, industry, and federal partners. And right now we have 25 members of that consortia. They just had their second board meeting. and it includes NIH and CMS, as well as patient groups and nonprofits. And that entity is going to allow them to pool financial resources, intellectual property, and ideas and priorities to work together to solve regulatory science needs. So they're going to be issuing grants for folks who are going to be answering the key regulatory science questions that are still outstanding in the medical device field.
Sharon Terry, Genetic Alliance. So under our umbrella, there are about 1,200 disease advocacy organizations, and I think disease advocacy organizations are not without the potential for conflict as well. So I think that, again, they're not one monolithic sort of entity, particularly as they try to understand what is the new business model with less funding and sequestration and all that from federal sources. One question that does come to us periodically, and I'm wondering whether it's a misperception, and maybe we can dispel it here, is that the CEOs of these organizations, if they take money from industry, and if they take enough money from industry, are not eligible to be experts or advisors for FDA. And some of the examples given to us are lots of these are about rare diseases or about Mendelian disorders, and maybe there's only one company in the world willing to work with them and perhaps even work on a drug development scenario with them, and so a lot of their support comes from one company in order to do the clinical trial necessary. What's the way that we can still have these experts, and it's also true about some physicians who are, maybe there's 2 experts in the whole world for a disease. How do we still have that expertise come forward, whether it's from a disease group or from a clinical community, and again, sort of parse whether or not that's actual true conflict or, in fact, there is a robust collaboration going on?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult in the FDA space, as you know. We've been doing a lot of work at the Center for Devices with NORD, the umbrella group for organizations with rare diseases, and this is a very pressing issue to them. Margaret Anderson from FasterCures has been an important part of those conversations, as has the Parkinson's Action Network as well. It's very, very tricky, and I know this topic was brought up during the recent FDASIA negotiations, and we are bound by our statute in terms of what we have to take into account. We do try to incorporate patient groups, regardless of conflict, into the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, and so under activities under that umbrella, we have access to their priorities, their desires, their expertise, and their information. And we try to take advantage of that as well. So these public-private partnerships that are separate and apart from government can give us some flexible structures to help us in some regards. So, but we do have to manage our conflicts well. So when it comes to advisory panels that are considering a specific product, for example, and Associate Commissioner Warner can talk about this more directly, we have to be very, very stringent. And so in those situations, that net, unfortunately, restricts a lot of our patient advocates from participating as well. Most of our patient advocates on our advisory panels they're an important voice, but they're unfortunately non-voting members. So it's a double-edged sword. We need to think about how we incorporate patient voices into the regulatory process more stringently.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Margaret.
I was just going to say, Sharon, it reminds me also, in a previous life, I worked in the HIV prevention and care space, and there was a different spin to the conflict, which was that the federal government was funding so many of the national AIDS organizations that many started to say, can we really respect the voice of these groups anymore, or is the fear of losing some of that government funding, stymieing them from saying what needs to be said? So I think you could find multiple examples like this, and I think it comes back to some of the things that have been really hammered out today in terms of transparency. There's another side of this coin, though, that we should make sure to remember, which is that many of the groups I referenced, the venture philanthropy groups, have started to fund industry. And so you could argue that's a conflict too, because they have a vested interest in seeing products be developed for their particular condition. So I think there's a whole new chapter to be written there of, you're seeing companies accepting money from these not-for-profits to stay in a particular space or to further goals. So it's going to just keep perpetuating, and we're going to have to keep dealing with it.
I just wanted to add that patient advocacy groups can be very helpful too sometimes when technology has been returned to the university. So there are just plenty of examples of where a company may terminate a drug that's in clinical development for a whole host of different reasons. And as a licensor at a university, having that license be terminated is only about 1/100th of what you need if you want to put that technology back in the hands of a new licensee. You need access to all kinds of information. And sometimes the companies that terminate that, it isn't that they're trying to hide the ball. They're just busy focusing their resources on the projects they want to pursue. And sometimes it helps to get their attention to get all of the relevant data back that you're going to need to put a new licensee in business and allow somebody else to give that drug a chance. And we've had some really good success from that angle.
Bernie?
Bernard Lowe, I wanted to ask a question about relationships between academic health institutions and industry. So I think a lot of discussion is about individual investigators going to industry and partnering on developing research to hopefully developing an effective product. But there are also these much larger scale collaborations between a university and one or more drug or biotech companies. And I would like to invite the members of the panel and also, I guess, other members of the audience who have been involved with these kinds of relationships, who certainly have a lot more power to bring people to bear on problems. Their experience with sort of how to manage the conflict of interest issues that arise there while still sort of promoting the research and gaining the benefits of the collaboration. You know, what are the challenges that you have faced? What are some of the pitfalls that were made starting out on these kinds of collaborations? And what are the lessons learned that other companies and academic institutions can learn from going forward on this path?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's so much less attention paid on to institutional conflicts, and I think that those on the front line can often be very cynical about the fact that they are put under an incredible standard and microscope, and an institution which has gigantic amount of interests involved is really sort of ignored and does get the both profits and royalties and so on without a lot of, as far as I know, a lot of rules and regulations. I think the conflict of interest has been in the last several years been looked at much more about purchasing. So if someone's on the Medtronic's board, they might really need to be excluded from spending $50 million of Medtronic's equipment and be excluded from that. In the past, I don't even think people were paying attention to that, but there is a very big focus on if you have purchasing power. On the other hand, there is also about, if you not dictate, but, controlling treatments or purchasing, and there are all these different relationships. They are being looked at, but nowhere near the amount of focus as the individual scientist or clinician.
I think it's an area where a lot of institutions have struggled. In 2002, the AAMC came out with guidelines for institutional conflicts, and they updated that in, I think, 2008 or 10. So there are guidelines out there. But one of the things you find if you're on the ground in one of these institutions is that you can't even identify where the institutional conflicts are if you don't have a very robust database that connects the vendors, the donors, the research, the researchers, the commercialization arm. And we've had a policy for conflicts of interest in institutional conflicts of interest in research since 2005. And we've struggled with how to manage some of those, and we've enhanced throughout all of these years the databases that have those kind of data in them that we can relate to them. So now we know if a trustee is invested in a company and that company's sponsoring research on our campus, and we go into it and we manage it. Some of the management tools are making sure that the investment side of the house and the commercialization side of the house aren't influencing decisions about research and about researcher promotion and evaluation of researcher performance. The second is that royalties coming into the institution one has to be careful now. So you've commercialized something, it's a product, you have royalties coming in that the institution has, and an inventor, one of the investigators on campus, might have royalties coming in. So not only do we manage those conflicts at the institutional and individual level, we manage those royalty streams. So for example, we have a rule that if you've invented something and getting royalties for its use worldwide, a heart valve ring, that you can get rich on royalties for that being put in at Hopkins or Mayo or one of the other medical institutions, but you can't get any money for the use of that by anybody at our institution, nor can the institution get those royalties. So management of conflicts of interest at the institutional level, I think, is difficult. It's sort of changing and evolving, but you have to have this information structure before you can actually do it in any kind of logical sense.
Dorit, if I could follow up.
Sure.
I actually was hoping to sort of get to a much more specific question, which is negotiating institutional relationships with drug companies. I know Neil Cohen at UCSF has negotiated, I guess, several of these arrangements between UCSF and several pharmaceutical companies. And I think that's a little different than the very important issues that Henry and Guy were talking about, which really apply to all institutional conflicts of interest. And I was actually going to ask either Heather Pierce or Gabriella, I don't know if she's still here, whether they have any information on sort of how to make those arrangements work smoothly and provide and reap the benefits of that kind of large-scale research collaboration without falling into the traps of just how do you set up those relationships. In 2009, we heard a number of institutional and actually industry leaders testified that they thought those large-scale partnerships were going to be the way of the future, much more, or in addition to the individual investigator and a partner somewhere in a drug company. So I was hoping someone could sort of focus on that.
That is a bit of a different question. If I had the question, now that I hear it, where you're headed, I would call Heather Pierce, who's right behind you, because Heather's actually knows a lot about the different kinds of partnerships that are taking place.
Yeah, I'm glad that it's...
Happy to talk, Heather Pierce. I also want to hear, too, from you, Todd, and your perspective. And I think to put a finer point on the question and to add some clarification as well, we heard from Neil Cohen this morning, and we've been hearing from a lot of our institutions about very interesting and unique kinds of partnerships that are maybe one company and one institution that may be scalable, that may be repeated at other institutions, that involve things like very unique IP sharing or giving up arrangements, embedded scientists, embedding industry scientists in academic labs and having joint sabbaticals or other types of collaborations, opening up libraries of molecules for repurposing, handing things over to academic institutions with maybe a right of first refusal if they find other compounds and those kinds of things. It does seem that these raise both extraordinary opportunities and some real difficulty in trying to figure out how do you characterize these types of relationships. They don't easily fit into our conflict of interest policies at most institutions. They're not very clearly an institutional conflict of interest, although they might raise those issues. I think they raise some challenges for conflict of interest review committees. They raise challenges for explanations to patients and the public. How do they fit onto these kinds of databases and in other kinds of transparency initiatives? What do they look like, and how do we repeat them and find out where really those essential elements of pulling the resources from the right place and combining them together work? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Todd, and others who have, Margaret, who have seen some of these really, through your Partnering for Cures conference, some really very interesting collaborations on this level.
Yeah, I will. I'll just add that I agree with what you just said. It's so on the continuum. There are the programs like Pfizer's CTI program, where they're tearing down research facilities and building and co-locating next to academia and wanting to sort of share the same halls, which kind of goes back to some models we tried more than a decade ago. And then as you move away from that end of the continuum, you get into partnerships that are more like the AstraZeneca-Penn partnership or the Gilead-Yale partnership. And I think in those, managing conflict of interest is simpler. It's more like it is managing it on a one-off grant, except that you're anticipating that there could be 10 or 15 that would occur through that kind of a partnership. And then you keep moving down the continuum until you get to Lilly's phenotypic drug discovery program, where their theory is we'll build it and you come to us and we'll screen your compounds. Again, the conflict of interest is easier to manage there because it's on the individual basis. So I agree, we're pretty well set up to handle most of those. It's the one on this end of the continuum where we've got people walking back and forth that take us into issues that are far beyond conflict of interest, quite frankly, and much harder to manage. But yet I think what I feel like is that's what the country wants to see, is more and more of that. And there are examples of places like Clemson with their ICAR program, with a strong partnership with BMW, and cohabitating the same facilities where they do research in, and they've done that quite effectively. And it would be interesting to learn more from them and others that have done that kind of program, what things have popped up.
I'll just go back to my previous comments about the patient perspective. I think if you have a glioblastoma and your life extension is from 9 months to, what did you say, 16 or 20, I think your motto is by any means necessary. And so I think these different collaboratives that you just described, I don't think they're going away. And I think given the funding crisis that you just referenced in terms of the two ends of the firecracker burning on the academic medical institutions, the reimbursement, from the payer perspective, and then the NIH funding, money's going to have to come from somewhere for innovation. So I think we're dealing with systems that weren't set up for this world that we're in and that we're going forward into. And so it's making people uncomfortable. But I think, we were just kind of chit-chatting off to the side for a second. If you are humming along and then you get your diagnosis and all of a sudden tomorrow life looks dramatically different, conflict of interest is going to look a little bit different to you. The conflict might be, when the doctor says, I got nothing for you, or go home and get your affairs in order because you're going to die in 6 months, which is what they told my dad when he got his cancer diagnosis. So I think all of this warrants discussion, examination, sunshine in terms of the terms of these agreements as much as we can glean from them, not the specific terms, but sharing. I think institutions are between a rock and a hard place right now in terms of figuring out what this model looks like. And I hate to say it, but every time I come to one of these meetings, and I'm not referring to my colleagues sitting up here, of course, because we're all young at heart, but every time I look out in the audience and it's the leadership of academic medicine, I'm thinking to myself, they're not going to be here in 5 years running these institutions. So I think the evolution of these institutions is going to be long and hard, and I don't think we know what the pathway looks like. So, I think some of these institutions are, jumping forward into a whole new place that is going to look and feel different. And then you have this federal overlay of, things that we're dealing with, to deal with something that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago. And we're still seeing it play out. So, sharing of these best practices, I think, is critical.
I'd say one of the patient advocate groups was formed, ABC Squared, to accelerate brain cancer cures. When it was founded by a very prominent, successful businessman whose brother was also chairman of, I think, Chase Manhattan Bank or something, had a glioblastoma. And they put together the best people from the FDA, from the National Cancer Institute, academics, industry, CEO of Genentech was there. And when everybody talked to each other, he was just stunned by how dysfunctional we are in medicine. I mean, just stunned. Said, you really stop each other from making any progress. And he asked why the pharmaceutical companies aren't doing more for brain cancer. and they say, well, you know, if they take a drug that they've invested $500 million in and they put it in the brain and the patient hemorrhages, they'll lose the whole drug. So they don't want to take the risk to treat the 20,000 brain tumor patients a year with their new drug because it could take it off the market. And from a business standpoint, they might be right. But we've set up a system that we're so focused on all the things, on the conflict of interest, on the obstacles, on the regulatory, don't hurt a patient, even though, I mean, it's incredible that we talk about not testing a drug in a patient that's going to live for a year because we're worried about the harm profile of that patient, and yet, you know, we're there to protect that patient. So I think in a way the whole system is not geared towards optimal outcomes, and that's why I think even, you know, the nomenclature of this is conflict of interest. It's a bad thing we're doing because we work together. It's crazy. It should be like, if you're not working with companies and with the FDA and with the NIH, that's where you should be ashamed that you're just sitting in an ivory tower in an academic institution, or you're sitting in a company and not getting the best of academics, et cetera. So I really think we need to turn this from a negative to a positive and start working better together. I mean, I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but that's really what we're here to do if we're going to make a difference, all of us, all different groups.
Yeah, this optimization is like one of the most critical features now, particularly because of the current funding situation and the current capital available for innovation in the private sector as well. We need to pool our resources, and that's why the Medical Device Innovation Consortium was built. You know, part of what we found is that, for example, we have a large intramural research program. A lot of folks don't realize that FDA has a very robust intramural research program, but we do a lot through collaborations. And just in cardiovascular computer modeling and simulation, we have 8 current consortia out there, and the consortia have between 3 and 8 members each. But negotiating the individual collaboration agreements and research agreements and CRADAs with each of those individual consortia members is incredibly time-consuming. So what we wanted to do in the MDIC was to build a platform that got a lot of the hard negotiations out of the way at the institutional level, so that we could then come together and do the nitty-gritty work later and promote the science. So that's why you know, these 25 members have come together. We have industry, we have academia, we have patient groups, because we're trying to get, it took almost 2 years to write the governance documents for that consortia. You know, how they're going to come together and share IP, you know, how they're going to come together and collaborate, how they're going to protect each other's confidentiality, how they're going to partner, how they're going to share resources. But that's now done, and that foundation is laid. So now when we have additional research that we do jointly, it should be a smoother path. And so that's the kind of institutional negotiation that you can do.
We have one question from the web, so from the University of Toronto, actually 2 questions, and then we'll go to you, okay? So one is to Dr. Lichter, and as a preamble, disclosure of COI is only a first step, and the questioner has a 2-part question. For Alan, what additional steps, if any, does your organization promote in addition to disclosure?
Well, in general, our approach is one of management, more so than a prescriptive effort. So, I mean, we look at the disclosures and try to see where especially for our scientific meetings, where a presenter has some serious issues. And we do things including reviewing slides, monitoring sessions, actually asking for the primary protocol to understand the work better, to make sure that we feel that the presentation is as much without bias as possible. It is simply impossible to completely eliminate bias, but we'd like to sort of level the playing field a little bit. So we take this pretty seriously and think that's a much better way of doing it than saying, well, then you can't speak to us and go home. So we work pretty hard at it.
Thanks. The second question was to Guy about, said, I'm intrigued by the conflict measurement measures you listed for the Cleveland Clinic, but wondering if you go further. For example, do you scrutinize interpretation and publication of studies or study design, things like that?
We can and have in some management plans restrict the role of the conflicted investigator in authorship. And an example of that, we might have part of the management plan that the conflicted investigator can't take the primary role in drafting, and that the statisticians who are not conflicted and don't report to the conflicted investigator verify the conclusions. So the answer is yes. We tailor all these management plans for the individual cases, and it's time consuming, but I think in the end it's better because in conflict management, one size doesn't fit all. And if you're flexible enough to take these on individually, you can stop yourself from inhibiting innovation and the furthering of research findings by having an overly restrictive and uniform policy.
Great. We have one more question from the floor.
Hey, my name is Sal Shah. A question for Dr. Brem. I was very interested in what you mentioned about that if a pharmaceutical company invests $500 million into a drug for brain tumors, and then if it causes hemorrhaging in one patient, they can lose the entire molecule, and the drug is off the market. I'm very concerned about the paradigm that the FDA currently operates on, which is kind of like a one-size-fits-all model, and that's completely opposite to what the future of medicine we would like to achieve is the personalization of therapies. We know that, for example, if a drug works well in one patient, it may completely be toxic in another patient. And it's not, I'm just wondering what we do with that information. Like, we know more than what the policies are based on right now.
So let me clarify that. That isn't what I said exactly. Or at least what actually happened at that meeting. So it was Steve Case who ran the meeting from AOL and the ABC Squared. And when he asked the CEOs of companies who had very promising drugs why they didn't have an arm in brain tumors, these were not brain tumor drugs that they were worried about one bleed, but these were, let's say, a breast cancer drug that they said had a huge patient population, and they didn't feel that they wanted to put it into a small group of patients that was a much higher risk of toxicity, which could lead to the drug being pulled off. So it is a little bit different. I mean, if it was targeted for brain tumors, then there'd be much more tolerance for neurotoxicity because those patients, can have neurotoxicity anyway. I think the issue of, I don't think the FDA eliminates things on one bad example, but if there's a side effect, the brain is very vulnerable. So we're in an area that people are afraid to test new drugs on. It's as simple as that. It's not.
I guess my biggest feeling, though, is that if the FDA's interest, if you talk about conflict of interest, somebody should have a strong interest as the basis of that. If the FDA's interest is safety and effectiveness of drugs, there is no such thing as a safe drug. These are drugs at the end of the day, and it's not, to balance risk and benefit, it's very difficult to categorically try to do that with what we know today.
So I just want to defend the FDA for a minute because I think they, at least I know the oncology drug side of the FDA much better than other parts of it, but they do I think a pretty darn good job of evaluating drugs and saying this drug has met its endpoint and should be approved. They have, we hear that the FDA, drugs in this country take much longer to be approved, et cetera, et cetera. Research was done and published last year to show that drugs in this country are approved faster than in other parts of the world, particularly compared to Europe. We get drugs through regulatory approval much, much faster. The new breakthrough designation, there are about 7 or 8 new oncology agents that are being released, fast track through the breakthrough portion. You know, as we look at applications that don't make it, it's very hard. Yeah, I must say, and I don't have a dog in this fight, except to say that when you look at the applications that don't make it, it's because the company trial didn't. I mean, it failed. And you know, companies often, and I don't blame them, want to say, but what about this little subset, or what about this little indication that left-handed redheads, you know, actually did better? And the FDA is just not going to accept that stuff. So I think the FDA and the oncology drug section does a pretty darn good job.
And I would add to that with the FDA is that with Gliadel, we worked with the FDA from conception, from a concept. Before we did the first animal experiment, we met with them. We asked them what it would take to get into clinical trials. We brought a proposal to them. They said, you need this, you don't need this. They said actually efficacy was not their primary issue in an animal model, that would be tested clinically. They really wanted to know pharmacokinetics and safety, so we got very quickly into clinical trials because of that understanding of what they were looking for. And the clinical trials, before we started, we had them unofficially approved by pre-meetings. They were very clear that it wasn't the official approval, but they said, boy, this is what we would like. This is reasonable, this is not reasonable. And then when we came back with the data, we had worked together on it, we got through. And we set precedents then that other people followed as to what they understood what the FDA was looking for, and it was pretty clear what they were looking for. And I agree with you, if you meet those criteria, if the drug works, then you get approval. So I'm not pointing fingers at the FDA, I'm just saying that there are a lot of forces to stop drugs from being developed or new treatments from being developed. The FDA is one. I mean, intellectual property is another one. I mean, the fear of other people using your IP without paying for it. There's a lot of things that make people nervous that stop progress. And we have to identify those things and show those as the real conflicts and get rid of them. I mean, that's the challenge, I think.
Michelle, you want to add anything?
Oh, Margaret.
Well, so I was just going to add another sort of storyline to this theme around the FDA. It's also around unanswered scientific questions. I think oncology, you know, you guys are sort of the tip of the spear in terms of, you know, having a robust pipeline and lots of experience to have, you know, to be kind of ahead of the curve. But there's lots of other areas in neuroscience, you know, Alzheimer's drug discovery, where I think it's unfair to say to the FDA, oh, why don't you just approve everything, when they don't even know what, you know, how should they be evaluating something? So I think, you know, you heard it in Michelle's comments, and we've certainly seen it over the past few years, the much more of a spirit of openness at the FDA and a recognition that they can't possibly do it by themselves. There's also an appropriations argument that I will make. I just stepped down as the president of a group called the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. That agency, you know, really doesn't have the appropriated resources to do the work that I'm sure it wishes it could be doing in terms of answering some of these scientific questions. I want to go back to the Henry example, though, with glioblastoma and the, you know, looking at a different indication for a drug that's already out there on the market. I think that the companies are also fearful from that risk standpoint of seeing some of these other, you know, indications be developed that, you know, for lack of a better term, could be messier, and what it's going to do to their business model in terms of getting financing for some of this early stage, you know, development. It's not cheap to run some of these trials that we're talking about to actually find the answers to the questions. And so the last thing that I think some of the companies, you know, can do from a business standpoint is, you know, sort of damage some of the work that they already have. I think in cancer you're seeing some excitement in terms of the prospect of companies working together differently and coming together to do the right thing to reap some benefit. So anyway, Michelle, I hope we've covered your back here.
Thank you. No, I bring it up only because it also relates to the earlier question that Sharon asked about including patient voices given conflict of interest. A lot of people don't realize that in the last user fee legislation, there was a provision for all the medical product centers to incorporate more patient views into our regulatory decision-making process. And at the Center for Devices last May, actually, we released a guidance called our benefit risk guidance that basically codifies what every reviewer at FDA does, which is take into account the balance between the potential benefit and the potential risk. But in addition, the guidance goes a bit further and gives our reviewers permission to actually take into account data on patients' views of those potential benefits and risks. And we're actually, we have a patient preference initiative where we're trying to expand the conversation about the methodologies for how best to measure that, so that we're not just taking individual stories, but we're really taking the pulse of the community and taking that into account when we're evaluating new therapies.
Thanks. So, any other questions from the floor? Then I will end by asking each one of you to address what you see as the biggest barriers to innovation, to encouraging innovation in the light of the conflict of interest landscape, and as an addition, if you could, after you start talking, whether you could say whether you see these barriers for yourself as well when someone else mentions one.
Well, thank you, because I wanted to ask to make a point, but I think I can make that point and still answer your question. I think one of the biggest barriers is that we have a reward system at the university, again speaking from the university perspective, that rewards a certain performance, and human beings are pretty predictable. They're going to respond according to whatever the reward system is. And I think too often it's easy to point our finger at things like conflict of interest and say, well, that's the reason I'm not going to do something as a faculty member. You know, if you're not really rewarded historically for participating in translational commercial-like activities or things that might lead to tech transfers, as a matter of fact, we used to discourage our faculty from doing it, well, then the tiniest of things might be all it takes to tip the balance and have you say, I'm just not going to do that stuff. So there are things that I think we have to continue to have a national debate around, and I'm not saying they're necessarily the right thing to do, but we can hire faculty that are more entrepreneurial if we chose to. Systems like the Georgia Research Alliance and the Smart State program in South Carolina are endeavoring to do that. We can make tech transfer related metrics part of tenure and promotion. We can adopt more friendly leave policies for faculty that might want to go join a startup company. We can open our doors to industry should we choose and let them commingle in the halls with us. So there are a lot of things we could do that would make it more important and emphasize the importance and encourage faculty. We could give them better advice on how to pursue an experimental protocol that uses commercially relevant milestones, not just scientifically relevant milestones. And what I mean by that is I can't tell you how many times over the years I've had an investigator come and disclose a potential new cancer drug to me to help progress a tumor, and what they've shown is that if they inject it simultaneously with the tumor cells, that they can keep the tumor from growing. And then I go out and try to sell that to industry, and they say, well, that's great, but that's not how you're going to treat that cancer. So, you know, those are things that can be integrated into the research we do at the university without necessarily taking us too far, that would just put us in a better position to be able to help innovation. And there are a whole host of other things that fall along those lines.
I think our biggest barrier at our institutions, our respective institutions, and that goes for government, industry, academia, nonprofits, is that we are drowning in the simple. We are not making the simple things simple. If we can find ways to streamline the most simple of agreements, the most simple of disclosures, so that we can get those out of the way, so we can focus our attention on the things that are more complex and more challenging, I think it would make a lot of this process a lot less burdensome and therefore a lot more attractive for more people to enter into. We have the same issues that you have in academia. We have intramural researchers, many of whom are also reviewers by day. So they're trying to balance their different roles. And if we make research too complex for them to participate in, then we're losing a great resource there and a great perspective and a great voice in this potential collaboration space. So I think we all need to think about how can we get the simple things off the table, like Guy was talking about, take the burden off of the PIs.
Yeah, I really agree with both Todd and Michelle. We see that where we've taken some effort to educate our faculty toward innovation, how it works, and putting leadership in charge of rewarding those kinds of behaviors. I think that gets rid of a huge barrier in academia. On the commercialization side of the house, we need, and I know it's not just Cleveland Clinic because I talk to colleagues at other institutions, the commercialization arm needs a much better way of vetting discoveries that are turned into them and communicating back to investigators and educating them about what needs to be done to move products and discoveries forward. And I think on the bigger front, I think conflict of interest is just one of the regulatory issues, as Michelle said, that's impeding innovation, impeding research, and getting in the way, by the way, of clinical practice. So I think a more logical and data-based approach to regulation would be an enormous help.
I think to echo Michelle's comments about drowning in the simple, I think sometimes we're also spreading kind of urban myth about, oh, we can't do that because of conflict of interest, or, oh, we tried that before. And so, if you look to this not-for-profit, patient-based venture philanthropy model, what they're really looking for as they approach conflict of interest is, how do you enhance the freedom to operate more rapidly to advance scientific innovation? And I would argue that everybody represented on this panel in their sectors wants the same thing. It's that we're letting things get in the way. So can we do the simple, take care of the systems that we talked about earlier in the day that were already created, while figuring out this point of intersection. And I think I just urge everybody, as you're approaching this issue, to keep that patient right in the front of your brain, because if you do that, everything becomes a little bit easier to figure out who you need to talk to, learn from, share best practices with.
I would just re-echo that the biggest issue is simplification, and taking, as Michelle said, just make it simple, because it's not that complex, and it should be revealed and disclosed, but it should not be, shouldn't even take an hour to fill that out. I mean, these things should be automatic and simple, and they should be one central repository where this is done on a routine, ongoing basis, and I think there are efforts to do that. But I think the problem is that we do stifle innovation, because for most, certainly clinician scientists, they're overwhelmed with conflicting requirements today, with a need to do more clinical work and more compliance and more time at the computer using electronic systems that are very onerous. And I think that as we make going into clinical trials and really bringing the innovations to the patients, just mountains of negativity, of the implication that there's something bad being done, it really does scare away a lot of people who could really change the way that we take care of patients. So I would also echo what Alan said earlier, that I love the idea of calling this a disclosure of relationships. And let's not use, why do we constantly say it's a conflict of interest? Everything's a conflict of interest. It's such a negative, it really does, it is a negative way of describing what actually can be a very important relationship. And it should be in the public. It'd be great to publish it on the web and in a newspaper and every place else. And as you said, if you're ashamed of it, don't do it. Not just don't do the research, don't do it. But I'm proud of the things I've done, and people should be. But that still means I have to spend hundreds of hours going through paperwork to show what I've done.
I'll make a couple comments. The first concerns the publication of disclosures and Sunshine Law and ProPublica and all this other stuff. I'll tell you two stories. In 1985 or 86, the Ann Arbor News FOIA'd the salaries of the faculty at the University of Michigan. And they announced they were going to publish them. And everybody completely, this was the end of 175 years at the University of Michigan. We certainly could not survive one day. And out the thing came, and it had a little buzz, and then it went away. And then they published it the next year and the next year. Now I don't think anybody hardly even looks at it. It's just part of the landscape of what goes on. The second story I mentioned before, but I remember being on the board of ASCO in the mid-90s, and what should you say? We had talking points of what should you say to a reporter if a reporter asks, where does ASCO get its support? And it was all kinds of ways of trying to steer them away from the question, and there's anti-competitive. I mean, we had 1,000 reasons why we couldn't disclose this stuff, and then finally we disclosed it, and not a lot of. I mean, not a lot of adverse things happen. And as Henry said, this is not stuff that we're ashamed of. And the work that we do is good. The interactions that physicians and researchers have with companies, many of them are outstanding and have led to critically important advances. And when the disclosure stuff comes out, there will be a buzz, and then the buzz will die down, and it will be part of the landscape. So let's not go into crisis mode here, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to survive this, and we're going to survive it just fine. For those individuals that are embarrassed about things, right, they should stop doing it because maybe they have a reason to be embarrassed. The second point I'll make is one I made earlier. I think it's incumbent upon us to do research on disclosure of relationship and conflict of interest and all of the trappings around it. We need to understand much, much better what is the view of patients, patient families, and the broader public. We need to understand what works well so we can do more of it, what doesn't work or has unintended consequence so we either can do less of it or evaluate whether those unintended consequences are worth it. Where are the high-risk areas so we can stratify and not say, as many commenters said, we're going to pay as much attention to the tongue depressor as we do to the complex MRI machine, which is what we do now in conflict of interest. We're not going to stop disclosure. It's here to stay. We're not going to stop change the regulations in any wholesale way, but we can influence it for good if we have data, and we can go to the regulators and say, listen, we thought it was going to do this. Here's how it plays out. Somebody said evidence-based policy making, heaven forbid we should actually make policy based on data. But if we don't do it, no one will do it.
Yeah, since nobody else mentioned it, I'll make a pitch for what I think is essential to be done. And I think it's public education of the nature, benefits, and risks of industry partnerships with academia. I don't think we have done a good job of it. I keep thinking the IOM or the AAMC or this Council of Academic Medical Societies, somebody should take the lead in publicizing the benefits of certain kinds of industry partnerships. The more I think about it, the more I think about every one of our institutions, the AAMC and the IOM on their own, and each of our academic medical centers should be doing this. And I think the opportunity to do it is now. The Sunshine Act is going to bring up questions, and there are opportunities here to answer those questions and to be forthcoming with those answers from industry, from companies, and from academic medical centers individually. And I think we should do it.
Thank you all. One thing I just wanted to end with that sort of struck me when listening to the various things that people are saying is that what seems to be really important is the culture of the institution. And if innovation is valued, then you find a way. And yes, it takes resources. And if innovation is not valued, then it's hard. So it's always hard, but the question is whether you're going to do it. And from what Todd said and Henry and Guy, that seems to be a really important factor. And maybe, everybody has to sort of look at the culture of where they are and see if that needs some sprucing up as well. I think we made the time exactly, so we can break and back at 4:05. Right, guys? Okay, thanks, everyone.